Welcome back. Let's try and connect with our expert now. The IEC is set to make an announcement tomorrow about the program for the forthcoming local government elections after meeting this weekend. We speak to Dawie Scholtz now, who is an elections analyst. Dawie, I certainly hope you can hear me now. Now, we know that there's no doubt that these elections will not be easy to predict or to model, given the latest developments with the ANC not registering over 90 candidates. Of course, we're still waiting for the IEC's way forward, but perhaps give us your expert analysis on what you think will happen come next month.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. It's an extremely uncertain situation, right? So the IEC needs to speak out about its position on the court judgment of Friday. And we need to get total clarity on exactly what will happen now with these missing ANC candidates. I think when we think about the potential outcomes in this election, there are two distinct scenarios to think about, right? So the one hypothetical scenario is where the IEC allows the ANC to register its missing candidates, in which case we have a relatively normal election where the ANC contests in every ward, and I'll speak about the expectations for that one in a moment. But then the second version, of course, of the election is where the ANC doesn't get to register its missing candidates, and where we have a very interesting, very unique and very disrupted election to look forward to. I think in both scenarios, it's actually an extremely uncertain situation for a number of reasons. So firstly, we've had very little polling this year, right? Secondly, we've also had by-elections stop quite a while ago. We haven't had recent by-election data, so it's very difficult to know what the current trends are within the electorate. And of course, we've also had really disruptive events in the last couple of months and weeks, particularly the rioting and looting which occurred a couple of months ago. I'm sure that would have affected people's political preference quite a lot. And we've had no polling or no by-elections since then. So it's super, super difficult to know. Having said that, I've been doing some modeling just based on the data that we have from the 2019 election and also from the last local government elections. And I think a couple of things, no matter what the uncertainties are true. And the things that are true is that for all of the major metros, Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, even eThekwini, this is going to be a really close election by the looks of things. Kind of lots of those municipalities are potentially going to be hung. So where no party reaches 50% or where maybe the ANC gets very close to 50%. So I think that's the one thing that looks very interesting. And the other thing which is just really clear from the data is that there's a real risk that this could be a very low turnout election. And if we look at the voters' roll, for example, the number of voters that are registered to vote in this election at this stage are 1.1 million fewer people than in the last election because we haven't had a registration weekend, right? And we'll see if we actually have one. But that's just one red flag to suggest that turnout may be a little bit lower. And then, of course, we also just know that turnout has been getting lower and lower in recent elections. And, of course, it's also been quite low in the last election. So I think there's a real risk that we could have low turnout and definitely very close elections, whether the ANC contests in all wards or not, in all of the major metros. And if the ANC does not contest and is not able to submit candidates, it's actually going to be a devastating result for the ANC, to be honest. They're going to take real losses in a lot of the metros and are kind of looking at significant losses across all of KZN. And, of course, kind of losing a significant opportunity to gain seats in the Western Cape as well, given that we know that they're not on the PR list at this stage, either in KZN or the Western Cape. And that's two big provinces that's going to have a really significant impact on this election.
And in fact, that's probably why the Constitutional Court, just speaking about the low voter turnout, that's probably why the Constitutional Court then said to the IEC to determine within 3 days, of course, tomorrow, if it is practically possible to hold a voter registration weekend ahead of people casting their ballot. There's a lot of interpretation outside there where the ANC is also hopeful that the IEC will also make some kind of a decision whether or not it will allow them to re-register those candidates that, it had not had the time to register. But just in terms of what you said, in terms of your modeling and your baselining, I know that you said it's very tricky to do because this is a very unique situation. But how much consideration have you made in the by-elections that we saw earlier where also there was somewhat of a low turnout. But we know that some political parties, particularly the DA, didn't do so well in some of those metros. How much consideration did you take, looking at the by-election versus just the 2019 election?
At this stage, mathematically, none at all. I've always believed that these by-elections are most relevant closest to the election. They've stopped a while ago. I think the by-elections earlier in the year, you're absolutely right, had two trends sort of baked into them that I think were statistically very clear. If we had by-elections showing those things, a month before the election or so, I would say the DA was in real trouble. And the two trends that we saw in the by-elections were basically that, white Afrikaans voters were moving a lot to the Freedom Front Plus, which obviously damages the DA because those voters used to vote for the DA in very large numbers. So that was a problematic trend for the DA, particularly in the northern part of the country, places like Tshwane, Pretoria, so on. But then the second trend was also amongst coloured voters. There were a number of by-elections in coloured communities in the Western Cape, in the south of Johannesburg, in the Eastern Cape, in the Northern Cape, where the DA was taking significant losses amongst coloured voters. We will see if those trends continue. I am inclined to believe that the riots and the looting that took place earlier in the year probably affected particularly the minority electorate a little bit. Of course, we have no polling or by-elections to prove that, which is why this is so uncertain, right? We're going to have to wait for the election to be certain. And honestly, in my mathematical opinion at this point, is that the best thing is to wait and see what the voting trends are looking like on election night. I think it's very difficult to say that the trends we saw earlier in the year in by-elections are necessarily going to make it through and also occur in the elections this year. But I want to say one more thing on something that you said, which is just about this registration weekend. I completely agree. I think it's imperative that there is a registration weekend, of course, because one of the key facts about local government elections is that people can only vote where they are registered, in your actual area where you're registered, right? So we know that the last registration opportunity was 2 years ago, and in these last 2 years, a lot of people would have moved house, would have moved to different parts of the country. And so if there's no registration weekend where people have the opportunity to change their registration details, there's a real risk that on election day, thousands of people could, rock up to their voting stations, and the IEC could tell them, look, sorry, sir, we see that you're registered, but you're actually registered in a different province, and you can't vote today for that reason, right? So I think it's really, really imperative that there's a registration weekend. And so sincerely hope that the IEC will tomorrow announce that they will find a way to do so.
Now, Dawie, a lot of focus on these elections, obviously noting the low registration turnout, but a lot of focus from South Africans because of just the things that are happening politically in our country at the moment. We also know that we're probably anticipating new voters. I want you to explain just some of the election jargon. You mentioned quite significantly the PR list. Talk to us about what it is exactly. What should people look out for in terms of even the outcome post the elections? Yeah.
So I think folks who've voted in local government elections before will remember the last time they voted in a local government election. When you go to the voting booth, you actually get two votes, right? You get a ward vote for your ward representative in your particular area, and you usually vote for a person to represent you. And that person obviously is from a particular party, and they indicate the party and the person. But that's what all these ward votes are for. And you would have heard some of the ANC's candidates were not nominated, or they didn't in time get nominated for the wards, right? That's usually half the seats in local government elections. So if you're living in a municipality with 100 seats, usually 50 would be ward seats. The other half of the seats are actually allocated to that second ballot you get, called the PR ballot, or proportional representation ballot. And there you don't vote for a person, you just vote for a party. You pick which party you support on that ballot. And then usually at the end of the day, the 50 PR seats in the municipality, if using that example of a 100-seat municipality, are allocated based on how both the kind of average support for the parties between the ward and the PR ballots. Now, the problem, for example, in KZN right now is that the ANC has not registered any PR candidates whatsoever, none, except for 3 municipalities. So if you're living in a municipality where the ANC didn't register PR candidates, it would mean that the ANC is not eligible for half the seats. So even if the ANC were to win every single ward in the municipality, they would only get 50 of the 100 seats. And we know usually in many municipalities, the ANC wins between 60 and 70% of the seats. So, 60% of 50% is 30, which means that in many of these municipalities which the ANC has historically governed, they may be down to as low as 25 or 30%. If they're not on the PR list at all, because fully half the seats are, of course, these PR seats, which is why this is so devastating for the ANC, particularly in KZN, but also in the Western Cape. Neither of those two provinces are there on the PR list in general, which is, as I've explained now, massively damaging because it's half the seats in these municipalities.
All right, Dawie, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate your analysis ahead of the local municipal elections. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, that was independent elections analyst Dawie Scholtz speaking to us there about the upcoming elections. Of course, the IEC is set to make an announcement tomorrow about the program for the forthcoming local government elections.